Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 26th of April of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Russia, because very important update is coming from this area. I'll remind you that yesterday there were talks between the President of the Russian Federation Vladimir Putin and Special Envoy Witkov, and he came to Russia just one purpose: to understand and to discuss the possibility of restarting direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. That was a very important issue. During the previous days we got lots of articles, lots of statements, lots of different things regarding the plan of the peaceful settlement provided by Trump. We know everything about Crimea, about Donbass, about different regions, about Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. We know everything and we understand everything, how exactly this peaceful settlement looks like. But the problem is that nobody knows for sure how and who exactly is going to sign this peace agreement, because the Russians are saying that Zelensky is no longer a legitimate president. He is nobody. He is nobody in Ukraine, and we don't recognize his signature as a legal signature. So this is the statement of Russia, and this is their opinion. And that is why yesterday Witkov came to Moscow with the purpose to discuss this issue, to discuss who is going to sign this document. But as I understand, they haven't found this solution. They still don't know, neither the Russians nor the Americans, who is going to sign this agreement from the Ukrainian side. But at least they managed to find deal one important step. Both sides probably decided to start the direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. I'll remind you that the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, in the past made lots of statements and told us lots of times that he doesn't care who will represent Ukraine. And Zelensky can also represent Ukraine according to Putin. The only problem is that Zelensky can't sign agreement with Russia. So that is why the Russians and the Americans and the Ukrainians can answer the next stage of the negotiations, and the direct talks between Russia and Ukraine can start. It doesn't mean that Putin and Zelensky are going to sign this peace agreement. Maybe somebody else is going to do this, but they can start these talks. And for example, today, probably several hours ago, the press secretary of Putin, Peskov, said that at a meeting with Witkov, Putin confirmed Russia's readiness to negotiate with Ukraine without, let's say, preconditions. This is very important, and we shouldn't think that Putin said that he is ready to negotiate with Zelensky. Russia is ready to negotiate with Ukraine, but it doesn't mean that Russia is going to negotiate with Zelensky. As for now, we don't know for sure who is going to represent Ukraine at these talks. Maybe Zelensky, maybe not him, maybe Zelensky, but obviously Zelensky is not going to be a person who will sign this agreement with the Russian Federation. As for the Western countries, today we received most of the updates from the territory of Rome, from Vatican, where European leaders came to probably to send in the final way the former Pope Francis, because several days ago he died as a result of illness. And according to information we have, lots of presidents, lots of leaders came to Rome. This video when Trump came to Rome with his wife, and later we got report that Zelensky came to Rome as well, and during his visit he was trying to find Trump, and he was trying to have a meeting with him, probably to discuss several important things. And right after everybody came to Rome, we start receiving updates that Zelensky managed to take Trump and to talk with him. For example, this is the photo of the day. First footage of Trump and Zelensky meeting at the Vatican. We don't know for sure what exactly Zelensky and Trump were talking about. Maybe they were talking about Putin's proposal to start direct talks. Maybe they were talking about something else. Very difficult to understand. But one thing we know for sure, that Ukrainian sources took this picture and they began spreading this information among the pro-Western sources, among pro-Ukrainian sources, with words that after this event, Zelensky and Trump are going to have another round of talks. But later we got report that there were no meeting between Zelensky and Trump, but Zelensky met with the president of France, Macron. Most likely he told him everything that he discussed with the president of the United States of America. And later we got another report that Zelensky also had talks with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, how to achieve peace and whether the meetings in Paris and London were productive. Zelensky told the essence of a very short conversation conversation with Trump. Meanwhile, the head of his office, Andrei Yermak, reported that he met with White House Chief of the Staff Susie Wiles and U.S. National Security Advisor Michael Waltz. So, as we understand, most likely Zelensky got the message that was transferred to him from the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. Now, let's return back to Ukraine because we have lots of very important updates, and probably the most important updates are coming from the Sumy-Kursk line. Today, first of all, this morning, we start receiving very interesting, let's say, video from the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. For example, in this video, we can see that Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov held a meeting at the command post of the the Kursk group of troops, where he heard reports from the command on the current situation and the actions of the troops to destroy the Ukrainian armed forces, which had penetrated into the territory of the Kursk region. So the most important part from this article is that the Russians recently have created another group of forces, the group of forces by the name of Kursk. I'll remind you that since the beginning of the special military operation, the Russians created the group of forces north, the group of forces east, the group of forces west, the group of forces center, and the group of forces Dnipro. And today, on the 26th of April of 2025, for the first time since the beginning of the special military operation, the Russians announced the creation of the group of forces Kursk, which means that the Russians have certain targets and certain goals exactly for this group of forces. And most likely, this group of forces Kursk is going to continue offensive operation further in the direction of the city of Sumy. Furthermore, today we got another very important video and another very important article. Today there was another meeting between the President of the Russian Federation Vladimir Putin and Commander-in-Chief Valery Gerasimov, and they were talking about the situation on the ground. And today Valery Gerasimov reported that the Russians managed to establish complete control over the Kursk region, and he made lots of very important statements. Let's discuss them in details. First of all, according to Valery Gerasimov, the North Koreans military, acting shoulder to shoulder with Russian fighters in the Kursk region, showed fortitude and heroism. That was stated by Gerasimov. So this is the first official statement by the Russian authorities that indeed the North Korean troopers took place in the battle for the Kursk region. The Ukrainian armed forces lost over 76,000 soldiers killed and wounded in Kursk region. In the liberated areas of the Kursk region, measures are underway to identify the Ukrainian armed forces soldiers who are trying to hide. 19 settlements in the Kursk region have been completely checked and cleared of mines. The creation of security zone in the Sumy region continues. 4 settlements have been liberated. More than 90 square kilometers are under control. So according to Gerasimov, 4 towns, small settlements of Sumy region are already under complete Russian control. Most likely he was talking about the settlements of Basovka, Novinke, Zhuravka and Veselovka. And as you can see, according to our map, all these settlements are under complete Russian control and colored in the Russian favor. So we believe that the Russians will use the group of forces Kursk with the purpose to continue offensive operation further. And today we got lots of videos from the settlement of Garnal. For example, the Russians stated that they managed to secure Kursk region, and the Russians, of course, they shown us the proofs. In this video, for example, we can see how the Russians established Russian flag probably in the most southern and the southwestern parts of the settlement of Garnal, which is 100% proof that the Russians managed to liberate the territory of this village, and most likely the Russians are planning to move further and to attack deep inside of the territory of Sumy with the purpose to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Zapsylia. We discussed this situation already. We discussed that there is a river of Psyol that encircles this village from many sides, and that the Russians during the previous days managed to destroy every single bridge that goes exactly in this area. Now the Ukrainians in the village of Zapsylia are caught in cauldron without any possibilities to be supported from the mainland. So most likely the Russians will continue exactly in this direction with the purpose to create secure zone along the border with the Russian Federation. Furthermore, we got lots of updates from the Belgorod direction. Today, the Russian sources published also this video where we can see how several Russian soldiers raised their flag in the most western part of the settlement. This is another proof that the Russians either finished the clearing of the Belgorod direction or about to finish this. When talking about different sources, they reported that indeed every single settlement in the Belgorod and in Kursk regions were retaken and liberated by the Russians. But despite the fact that the Russians established complete control over every single settlement in Kursk and Belgorod directions, there are still several sources that report that Ukrainians control some tree lines, some forests along the border. So, for example, since Russian counterattack, we haven't received anything, for example, from this territory. So it's now we don't know for sure whether this small, let's say, territory under complete Russian or Ukraine control. The same story about this huge forest. We don't know for sure who controls these forests by the end of the 26th of April of 2025. And another important detail that I would like to point to your attention, you know that when the Ukrainians started their offensive operation, when they managed to establish control over Surja region, I reminded that at some point the Ukrainians decided and tried to open another front line, and the Ukrainians were trying to establish control over the settlement by the name of Glushkova. The Ukrainians made several attempts to attack in this area, but those attacks were repelled. But anyway, during those attempts, the Russians, trying to shorten the lines and to save their soldiers, they destroyed bridges along the river of Seym. So the Russians expected that Ukrainians could try to attack the settlement of Tyotkina through these bridges like this, and that is why the Russians decided to destroy all those bridges and to evacuate their soldiers from Ukrainian side of the river of Seym on the Russian side of the river of Seym. And when the Russians finished that evacuation, they destroyed all bridges in this area. And later we got reports that Ukrainians established complete control over the territories of the Russian Federation on the Ukrainian side of the river of Seym. And there is one small village by the name of Atruba. So most likely this village wasn't recaptured by the Russians when Gerasimov, the head of Russian army, made, let's say, his statement today. But obviously we understand that maybe this is not so big deal for the Russians, and maybe this village doesn't have any value, and these territories, anyway, we're just trying to tell you that despite the fact that the Russians reported that they managed to secure the entire Kursk and Belgorod regions, there are still some positions, some territories, some fields, some tree lines that are still under Ukraine control, and these constructions, these facilities are located on the territory of the Russian Federation. But despite this situation, most likely the Russians will continue offensive, and they will move further with the use of group of forces Kursk. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kupiansk direction. As for the northern Kupiansk area, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything. We see that the Russians reduced their activities in this direction, and probably this situation mainly is connected with the fact that if the Russians and the Ukrainians are planning to sign any peace agreement, and then according to this peace agreement, the Russians would be forced to fall back and abandon these territories, because these territories, according to peace agreement, should be returned back to Ukrainians. So that is why the Russians lost any, let's say, not value, they lost any need to continue their offensive operation in this direction, because if they are going to sign any peace agreement, they would be forced to return these territories back to Ukraine. So that is why we believe is the main reason why the Russians slowed down their offensive until at least they get additional updates or better information to understand what exactly they're planning to do next. As for the southern Kupiansk direction, the Russians continue offensive operation in this region, because this northern part, the area around the settlement of Liman, the Serebryanka forest, and the settlement of Slavyansk are the parts of the Donetsk region. So this is the territories that the Russians, let's say, tasked themselves before the beginning of the special military operation as the primary target to finish the war with the Ukrainians, to restore control over the entire Donetsk region. So that is why the Russians continue their offensive operation in this region, and according to information we have, currently there are very heavy clashes for the settlement by the name of Nove. According to information we have, the Russians continue their offensive operation, trying to establish complete control. We discussed this report during the previous video, and as you can see, nothing has been changed since this moment. So we expect that either tomorrow the Russians will take under control the village, or the Ukrainians would be able to restore or repel every single Russian attack and to hold their positions. At the same time, the Russians continue continue their offensive operation in the direction of the city of Liman. As for now, during the previous 24 hours, a lot of artillery strikes and FPV drone strikes were recorded. The Russians are hunting Ukrainian positions and the temporary deployment points of FPV drone operators, trying to get them and to destroy them as soon as possible, which will lead. This will allow the Russians to clear attacks roads and to begin offensive in the very near future. As for the Chasiv Yar, Toretsk and Konstantinovka direction, during the previous 24 hours we got some updates, not so many as usually, so let's discuss them. As for the city of Chasiv Yar, there are still very heavy clashes, but as you can see, without any changes on the ground and with almost a complete absence of any geolocations. Very difficult to understand what is happening here right now. Either the Russians regrouping and preparing themselves before the beginning of offensive, or maybe there are very heavy clashes, but we haven't received anything. As for the Konstantinovka direction, during the previous 24 hours, the main updates are coming from the territory along the railways between the settlements of Dachne and the settlement of Alexandra Shultine. Today, several pro-Russian resources reported that as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to establish complete control over these territories. Basically, the Russians established control over huge territories, and currently the situation in this area looks approximately like this. So, pro-Russian resources reported that this entire pocket, this entire territory was taken by the Russians during the previous 24 hours or during the previous several days. If this information is correct, this is something like the beginning of complete collapse of Ukrainian defense in this pocket, and after this defense line, most likely the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back further in the northern direction towards the settlements of Alexandra Shultine and the settlement by the name of Bilagora. So the Russians are advancing, and we see that the Russians are trying to cut this pocket completely and to reach the outskirts of the settlement of Konstantinovka. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians haven't continued their offensive in the Kliban-Bykska direction, but as you can see, without any changes on the ground. As for now, the Russians managed to get the next defense belt. We discussed the situation many times, and if you remember, I told you that most likely the Russians would be slowed down on the line between the settlements of Alexandropol, Zarya and Romanovka. So this is the line where the Ukrainians are trying to slow the Russians down and not to allow them to move further in the northern direction. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. We start receiving lots of updates from this area, and it seems that the Russians resumed their attempts to attack further in the northwestern direction with the purpose to cut as many as possible supply lines that go in the direction of the city of Pokrovsk. For example, to the north of the railways between Udachna and Kotlina, we start receiving lots of videos how the Russians were pummeling and destroying positions of the armored forces of Ukraine in strongholds and between the temporary deployment points. In this video we can see several strikes on the positions of the 152nd Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine on the territory of this mine. A bit further in the northeastern direction we have another video where the Russians were bombing the positions of the Armored Forces of Ukraine along these three lines. So we see that the Russians are trying to destroy Ukrainian positions, and obviously they have just one purpose: to move further in the northwestern direction. The Russians understand that if they can move further in the northwestern direction, and let's say to establish complete control over at least these territories, then this is going to be the beginning of complete collapse of the western and the northwestern flanks of the city of Pokrovsk, because from these positions the Russians would be able to establish complete fire control and FPV drone control over the road M30 and over the railways that go in the direction of the city of Pokrovsk. At the same time, we remember that the Russians continue their offensive operation along the eastern flank of the city of Pokrovsk with the purpose to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Novaya Ekonomichna. So all these attacks, all these, let's say, attempts to attack from both directions can lead once again to complete collapse of Ukrainian positions and Ukrainian defense in the Pokrovsk agglomeration. So this is exactly what is happening right now. As for now, the Russians just at the beginning of this way, but obviously they will try to intensify their activities. Now let's move further. We start receiving different updates of Russian attack towards Novoalexandriivka. Today, pro-Russian resources published this video where we can see Russian attempts to attack towards the settlement. The Russians, as usually, were using a lot of vehicles, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles. The Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt, and a lot of mappers reported that the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. Basically, according to several reports, the distance between Novoalexandriivka and edge Russian positions is less than 2 kilometers, which is already basically the beginning of the battle for this settlement. Of course, it's now very difficult to talk about Russian offensives because, once again, the Americans, Witkov, reported that the Russians are ready for talks, but we see that despite the Russian readiness for talks, they are not planning to stop offensive operation. As for the Novopavlovka and the South Donetsk direction, there are still very heavy clashes for the southeastern part of the settlement of Bogatyr, and as you can see, without any changes. The Ukrainians hold their lines. The Ukrainians doesn't allow lines to be, let's say, breaking by the Russians. Southeastern part of Bogatyr is a very tough nut that the Russians can't crack. As for the, let's say, South Donetsk direction, the main activities are coming from the line between the settlements of Obratne, Timirovka, Zelene Pole, and Novopol. During the previous 24 hours, we got this video where we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking and destroying the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine in these settlements. So these strikes looks like artillery and aviation preparation before the beginning of another full-scale offensive. So we expect that the Russians are going to intensify their activities with the purpose to establish complete control over these territories between the settlements of Privilne, Novoselka, Zelene Pole, Obratne, and the settlements of Novopol. So these territories the Russians are trying to establish control over, or will try to do this in the very near future. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.